So with that, let me introduce Dan Cavallo.
Thank you very much, and thanks for coming out on this chilly April night. I appreciate that. I actually grew up not far from here in Syracuse. So a lot to talk about. I actually just got back from Venezuela Monday night. I was there for several days in Caracas, but I also went to the Lara state, about 6-hour drive west of Caracas on the way to the Colombian border. For about half the time, roughly half the time we were there, we were without electricity. They're still struggling to get the electricity back on, and of course, when you don't have electricity, you forget sometimes you also don't have water, you don't have internet, you don't have phone service, you can't pump gas. You know, it's a real difficult situation they're going through. But really, what amazed me was that despite the fact that now for 2 weeks they had a 5-day run where they had no electricity in 80% of the country, and then they started getting it back on again. But it's been sporadic. So for basically 2 weeks, they've been struggling for many hours without electricity, water, gasoline, these things that we all take for granted. And yet, I can really honestly say that Venezuela was very calm. It is not on a knife's edge, as we're being led to believe. When I was in Barrio Metro, which is about the 5th largest city, 6 hours west of Caracas, the electricity had gone out the night we were there. And aside from a big party that was going on until 3 in the morning that was being hosted by someone with a big pickup truck that uses headlights to light the party, once that party was over, it was really quiet in the city. I mean, really quiet and peaceful. And I found Caracas the same way. I mean, things were functioning in Caracas. People were on the streets. They were walking. They were going to shops. They were going to work. They were driving. So they're managing at this point. And I think, and the folks that I talked to have said that, if anything, what's happening now is really bringing people together in Venezuela. Even opposition, a lot of opposition people are not excited about this Juan Guaido guy, who, by the way, a poll showed at the time he declared himself president, 80% of Venezuelans didn't even know who he was. And we know now that, of course, Mike Pence, there's, for many months, the U.S., Washington's been grooming Guaido, and that Pence called him the day before he declared his presidency to tell him to declare himself president. So it's all clearly being manipulated and orchestrated from Washington, which should come as no surprise. With that said, I like to start my Venezuela discussion. And by the way, I have a new book coming out on Venezuela, and Oliver Stone's doing the introduction. So
cool.
I have Venezuela very much on my mind. And I have a chapter on 3 massacres in 1989 that most people have never heard of. If they had, they forgot about it. Many people remember 1989 for 2 things: the fall of the Berlin Wall and the Tiananmen Square massacre. 25 years after the Tiananmen Square massacre, there was a huge commemoration of it in the newspapers, and at the time, and I remember it vividly, the events happening in Tiananmen Square were being covered every day in the press, and it was a very important historic event. But the massacres I talk about in my section were not Tiananmen Square, and they basically are largely unknown. So let me see a show of hands. How many people in the room have heard of the Caracazo? Okay. we got one. How many had heard of Tiananmen Square?
Oh, yeah, sure.
Okay, everyone. So the Caracazo also happened in 1989. And the death toll, which was in Venezuela, is, and you can look this up on Wikipedia or whatever, the estimates are about the same as the death toll in China. It's not known for sure how many people died, but it's anywhere between 300 and 3,000 people, which is about the estimate for Tiananmen Square. And of course, at the time, Venezuela had about 25 million people. China had 1 billion. So the numbers proportionately are much greater in Venezuela. Moreover, with China, what changed in China after the Tiananmen Square massacre? Nothing. Historically, it wasn't a significant event in that sense. The Caracazo, on the other hand, transformed all of Latin America. And so what was the Caracazo? In 1989, the President Carlos Perez, who had run on an anti-neoliberal, anti-IMF program, within weeks of being elected, adopted IMF austerity measures, which included a large doubling of the oil prices, domestic oil prices, which also led to the doubling of public transportation costs. And the poor of, particularly Caracas, and Caracazo is suggestive of Caracas, but throughout the country, the poor rose up in demonstrations, some peaceful, some violent. There was looting. And the police and the military responded viciously. And they started shooting people on the streets. My friend Tulio, who I just met in Venezuela, I saw again, and I was talking to him about the Caracazo, and he was 10 years old at the time, and he remembers soldiers putting dead bodies on a truck and driving them away. And they have found mass graves afterwards. And again, it's uncertain exactly how many people died, all at the hands of the state forces. But again, it ranges in the 300s to possibly 3,000 people. And what changed because of that event? Well, it led to the rise of Hugo Chavez and the political movement that would elect Hugo Chavez in 1998. This was a very conscientiousing moment, not only in Venezuela, but throughout Latin America. And up until that point, Venezuela was, they were famous for being one of the few kind of long-standing democracies in Latin America, although that's not true. It really wasn't. They went through a series of dictatorships that, of course, the U.S. supported every single one. But that was their reputation. And the mask was torn off in 1989 for those paying attention, but again, very few people were. I myself have been involved in Latin America for many years, since I was 19, since 1987. I never learned of that event till fairly recently. In fact, I talked to Chomsky about it, and I wrote an article called A Tale of Two Massacres, Tiananmen Square and Caracazo, which is kind of a Chomskyist move. He likes to compare the media's fixation on the crimes of others that we don't like the Chinese, versus the crimes of those who we're aligned with, like the government of Venezuela at that time. And even he said, boy, I never thought of that. So before I get to the main discussion on Venezuela, I just want to mention, since I have this chapter, there were two other significant massacres in 1989 that, again, if you know about. One occurred a month after the fall of the Berlin Wall, and that is the murder of the 6 Jesuit priests in El Salvador by U.S. sponsored and trained forces. This was really the crescendo of the Salvadoran civil conflict. In addition, it was really the crescendo of the U.S.'s war against liberation theology. When I was growing up, I was raised Roman Catholic, and in a very right-wing household, and my dad was a real Cold Warrior. And I grew up believing that the U.S. existed, to fight the godless Reds, right, to protect essentially Christianity. And it really, when I was a young person at age 12, one of the first things that made me start thinking differently was when Archbishop Romero was killed in 1980, again by U.S.-backed forces. And as many of you know, he was just declared a saint in October of last year. And he was one of many such clerics that were killed by U.S.-backed forces in Latin America, and intentionally so. And in fact, as many of you probably know, the U.S. School of the Americas, which trains Latin American military leaders, took credit for the destruction of liberation theology on its website. In fact, there's a book called The School of the Assassins, which talks about the fact that they had many simulations at the School of the Americas. Soldiers who were being trained there would have to learn, what they were supposed to do. And in 75% of the scenarios that they would run at the School of the Americas, a priest would be portrayed by someone, and that priest would be either beaten up or killed, because they were a target of the U.S. In Latin America. By the way, in Colombia, which I'll get to in a little bit, because I do think it's very significant to talk about neighboring Colombia here. 80 Catholic priests, one archbishop and one bishop, have been killed in that country since 1984. 80 priests. If that were Cuba, that, for example, they'd be vaporized by now, right? But this is all according to plan. So, in any case, I don't want to digress too much on that. So, again, to go over very briefly then the history. So, when Chavez was elected, and it was a surprise that he was elected, with about 56% of the voters, so in 1998, he moved very quickly to do several things, all of which are things that are rarely discussed in the U.S. press and very much mischaracterized. For one, as many of you know, he labeled the revolution in Venezuela a peaceful revolution. The Bolivarian Revolution, after Simon Bolivar, the liberator, who united most of South America after defeating the Spanish and removing the Spanish from the domination of Latin America. So Chavez wanted to do the same thing, in a sense. He wanted to unite Latin America. And he began to do that through things like ALBA, the Bolivarian organization that he started, that recruited a number of countries in Latin America, which helped each other through medical teams and cheap oil, various things to collaborate and cooperate with each other. The goal being that they could become less dependent on the United States. One of these programs is known as Operation Miracle, for example, which is mostly a Venezuelan-Cuban operation, which has given sight to millions of people around the world. That's what they do. They offer free eye surgery to people who are blind but have a correctable condition. And it's been very successful. Interestingly, one of the people that they cured, and they knew who this guy was one of the guys who killed Che Guevara in Bolivia. The other thing that Chavez did, which again people I think either don't know or forgot about, he and Fidel were very instrumental in bringing about the peace agreement in Colombia. They really led that in a very significant way, because the FARC, which was the left-wing guerrilla group there, they were very influenced by Fidel and Chavez as well, and both Chavez and Fidel told them, okay, it's time to give up the guerrilla war, and it really helped bring them to the table. And every single peace negotiation session was held in Havana, Cuba. So Chavez played a very significant role. And as you know, after he was elected, I heard him speak actually in 2010, Chavez. And he said when he was elected, the only light on in the house was Cuba. Because by the time he was elected, the Sandinistas had been voted out of office, largely because of the Contra War. And Latin America was very much in a reactionary period. But after Chavez was elected, one after another country went progressive and left-wing. And in the words of Noam Chomsky, Chavez would lead the liberation of Latin America after 500 years of Spanish and then U.S. domination. Not a small feat. The other thing he did was to try, and again, in light of the people who brought him to power, which were the poor people and working class people of Venezuela, he quickly moved to create social missions to eradicate and lower poverty. And for the first 15 years of the revolution, 1999 to really about 2014, 15, year after year, Venezuela was lauded, even by the World Bank and IMF, for lowering poverty and extreme poverty by significant percentages and increasing economic equality in that country. They provided free health care to the population, brought in a lot of Cuban doctors to help with the health care. In return, gave the Cubans subsidized oil. And again, they worked together, the medical teams, Cuban and Venezuela, not only on this Operation Miracle, but in other countries, for example, in Haiti, where the New York Times itself had to admit that Cuba and Venezuela were on the front line of fighting cholera in Haiti after the earthquake. He initiated other social programs, including one that continues to be very successful to this day, and that is the building project to build affordable housing for the poor. They've built 2.5 million units, housing units, for the poor in Venezuela. 2.5 million, think about it. And I've seen some of these, they're very nice. Let's assume an average family of 4 times 2.5, that's 10 million. 10 million people housed out of a population of 30 million. It's not shabby. And people will tell you, and I will tell you, now of course anecdotal evidence is a little dangerous because you don't see everything, but I don't see homeless people on there. And I think you won't see many, because that is one thing they've really combated. I would say certainly less. The conditions on the streets of Venezuela are much nicer than, for example, in parts of Bogota, which Colombia has been to. Or cities like San Francisco, which have their tent cities, in Seattle, and even Vancouver, considered the most livable city on earth recently, and, have a huge homeless problem. In any case, this isn't something to get a lot of credit from. But in addition to eradicating poverty, trying to build a regional integration, he also did a lot for Afro-Venezuelans and indigenous Venezuelans, who were people who were largely forgotten and invisible prior to his election. There's a large number of Afro-descendants in Venezuela, which people don't often think about, who came to the way many African descendants came to this hemisphere, and that was through slavery. And very quickly, Chavez created a constitutional assembly, which was worked on throughout the country, and they drafted a new constitution, which was approved by a popular referendum, which set forth for the first time the specific rights of Afro-Venezuelans, indigenous Venezuelans, which talked about indigenous languages as being national languages of Venezuela. And Chavez began to give land back that was stolen from Afro-descendants and indigenous people. And if you look at the rallies, to this day of the opposition and the people in rallies supporting the government, you will see a very difference in skin color. It's the whiter, more better off people who are in the opposition. And it really is the darker skinned, poorer people who support the revolution. And one thing that people have to understand is that the opposition resents the heck out of the fact that their country was taken away from them. That's how they view it. They resented Chavez, who they viewed as black. They resented having a black president. They resent Maduro for the same reason. Maduro was also a bus driver, by the way. Chavez was born in a mud hut, famously. This isn't the type of president that the elite of Venezuela wants. And this is one thing that people don't see or aren't told. I think if you look at the people on both sides, at least for me, it's not hard to decide, who you support. The other thing Chavez did, again, very much in contradiction of a lot of the press claims, is he democratized Venezuela. Through the 1999 Constitution, which was popularly approved, he created a new branch of government, which was beholden to no other branch, and that is the Venezuelan Electoral Commission, the CNE, which independently runs their electoral system, and which uses this very sophisticated voting machines, which are very reliable, which rely on fingerprints and voter IDs to even get the machine to turn on, which allows people to cast an electronic vote, which is then backed by a paper receipt, which is later audited by the end of the night. Polling stations in 54% of all the polling stations in Venezuela are audited to make sure those paper receipts match up with the electronic ballot. And Jimmy Carter said that of the 92 elections he observed, Venezuela had the very best electoral system in the world. And this was thanks to Hugo Chavez. Carter said that the U.S. had one of the worst, but that's fine. In fact, there's a huge irony, of course, here. The guy, Donald Trump, who lost the election in the U.S. by nearly 3 million votes, Hillary Clinton, is questioning the legitimacy of Nicolas Maduro, who got 67% of the votes cast just last May. It's really incredible that people don't see the irony in that. Of course, we would defend saying, oh, well, that's our system. We have an electoral college, which was founded, of course, to preserve slavery, but we won't talk about that. We never do, but that's our system. You can't say we're not democratic because that's our system, but yet we judge other countries every day because we don't think they're up to snuff, right? But that is one thing that Chavez did. And the other thing in the Constitution, it allows for a recall. And Chavez stood for recall twice. And in addition to that, he had to run again. He was elected in 98. He then ran again in 2000 and was reelected because he had to run under the new Constitution, right? There are numerous elections. I mean, as someone said, for a country that's not democratic, they have an amazing amount of elections in that country. And frankly, from the day that Chavez was elected, the U.S. has been trying to topple him, which is another thing that needs to be kept in mind, because a lot of us are kind of told that, this is new because they've really gone off the deep end, and now we really have to go after them. But that would ignore the fact that the U.S. in 2002 already orchestrated and supported a successful coup against Chavez, in which he was kidnapped. He was kidnapped by rogue members of the military who took him to an island. And for 2 days he was held there And the plan was to kill him. And the only reason he returned as president is because the people from the poor barrios of Caracas came down from the mountains and they went to the presidential palace and they demanded their president back. And yet this is a very inconvenient truth that we are not told. And it's very revealing of both sides how the coup played out. So first of all, you had a violent coup, in which not only Chavez but other ministers were kidnapped. And by the way, two people who were part of kidnapping were Leopoldo Lopez and Enrique Capriles, who people say, oh, it's so unfair, they're not allowed to run in elections. I defy anyone to tell me what would happen if you or I kidnapped Donald Trump and took him away for 2 days and he was returned. We would be vaporized. And yet those people have largely, what did Chavez do after that? He ended up granting a general amnesty to everyone who participated in this violent coup. Most of my Venezuelan friends think that was a mistake. That he should have put those people in jail because they continue to run amok in that country. But Chavez was a Christian, he was a Catholic, and he really believed in Christian forgiveness, and he forgave those people. And he actually changed his manner of governing. You might recall that before 2002, like Fidel, because he loved Fidel, he used to wear fatigues, because he was a military guy himself, right? He came out of the military. He'd wear fatigues and his red beret, and he was very strident. After the coup, he decided, no, I gotta start being different. He started wearing civilian clothes, lost his beret, and tried to conciliate with the opposition. With an opposition who had no desire to conciliate. So what did the opposition do, aside from kidnapping people? The first full day in office, Pedro Carmona, again, another self-declared president, he was the head of Chamber of Commerce, that's how he got his job, went on national TV, and you can see this, by the way, great movie. I would urge you to watch if you haven't already. The Revolution Will Not Be Televised, which deals with all of this. It's done by an Irish film crew who was in Venezuela at the time, wanting to do a film on Chavez. They were in the presidential palace at the time he was overthrown, and so they have this incredible footage. It's an amazing film. But they show Carmona on TV saying, here's the Constitution of Venezuela. It's gone. The National Assembly is gone. The Supreme Court disbanded. Attorney General fired. Every mayor and governor elected since Chavez was elected is fired. This was democracy opposition style. And of course, the New York Times, our paper of record, immediately said this was an advance for democracy. This was happening. The U.S. is one of the few countries in the world that recognized this coup, until sheepishly everyone who did support that coup had to turn tail and run after Chavez was brought back to power. And it's interesting now because you are not seeing those types of mass protests demanding that Juan Guaido be brought into power, because he does not have popular support in that country. So meanwhile, obviously a lot of things happened, but after the coup, which ended up being, because, whatever doesn't kill me makes me stronger, Chavez did have a certain mandate after the coup. Again, many people think he should have used that to go after the opposition, but he didn't do that. What he did do is continue his anti-poverty work and advancing, the social revolution in Venezuela, again, to great success. So what happened? In 2014, things start to go south for Venezuela on purpose. So, as we know from a number of sources, including the Independent of London, in 2014, the U.S. and Saudi Arabia decided that they would collude to lower world oil prices. And so Saudi Arabia, with the U.S.'s blessing,